Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. This is the fourth and final episode that I'm going to do about Randonautica, for now at least. So I talked about some of the experiences of synchronicity that I experienced in the past while randonauting and while just thinking and talking about Randonautica. And I also have talked about Randonautica's seeming fixation with bringing me back to a place that I have been both obsessed with and repelled by, the part of the Hellgate by Astoria Park here in New York City. So in this episode, I want to talk about some of the themes that I've seen crop up repeatedly while randonauting, everything aside from the Hellgate stuff that I talked about last week. So quick reminder, Randonautica is an app. It's free. You download it on your phone. You set a radius, it chooses a point within that radius, and if you have set an intention in your head before generating that point, it's likely that the point will have something to do with the intention that you set, or at least that's the idea. So before I get into this episode about specific experiences I've had while randonauting, I do want to talk about something weird that has happened in the last week. So, in I think the second episode that I did about Randonautica, I talked about some strange synchronicities that have happened while talking or thinking about Randonautica or randonauting. So, last week I talked about how after doing a solo Estes session by the Hellgate in Astoria Park, I was walking home and a manhole cover exploded in flames next to me. I had to, call the fire department, etc. And I talked about how I really don't like fire, etc., etc. And, I made the episode art for the last episode, a rendition of flames coming out of the manhole. And I think I may have even mentioned in that episode, fires aren't super common here. Like the building I lived next to burnt down in 2019, and I had that experience with the manhole cover exploding, but typically there aren't that many fires that I encounter in my daily life. I guess like once in 2018, I was on the subway and the train had a minor fire and had to be evacuated. So it happens occasionally, but really, really not often. That's 3 times that I can think of since I've lived in New York City. So in the last week, I've had 3 separate experiences that have been tied in with fire or explosions. So the first one is I noticed one evening that I could smell fire. It smelled like something burning. And I was like, I guess the weather's nice and someone's grilling. Sometimes the neighbors grill, and because of how the yards are set up, you can't really see into their yard. But sometimes you can smell it. So I was like, it's probably just someone grilling a little bit too enthusiastically and their food burned. And it was really strong, whatever. So a little bit after that, someone knocks on my apartment door, and of course it's a firefighter, and he mentioned that there had been a call to the fire department about a fire in our building, and he was just checking to make sure everything was okay. I never found out exactly what happened, and I, talked to at least one other person in my building who also wasn't really sure what happened. My guess is that someone burned their food while cooking, but it got a little bit out of hand. Because it was a pretty strong smell in my apartment. I just was assuming it was not coming from inside. So there was that fire. And, I looked out the window and there were 3 fire engines outside with all the lights on and everything. So, the fire department did come. It was fine. But that happened last week. Then last Thursday, I was out at a dinner with my in-laws and my wife. And we were eating, near where we live in Astoria. And suddenly there's this very loud sound, and people in the restaurant started kind of freaking out. And it turns out that a battery had exploded in the kitchen. So, they had to shut down the kitchen. There was a pretty acrid, strong smell. There wasn't a lot of smoke, and I don't know if there were open flames since it happened in the kitchen. But if there were, they would have extinguished it pretty quickly because there wasn't a lot of smoke. But you definitely could smell this chemical burning smell that was pretty strong. And it had been a pretty loud explosion sound because we were sitting very far away from the kitchen out on the street and we could still hear it. So I was like, okay, that's kind of weird, whatever. Then today I was, working in the study in our apartment, and I started smelling this really, really strong chemical burning smell. And like I looked outside, I didn't really see smoke. I couldn't really figure out where the smell was coming from. So then I was like, okay, I'm just gonna go outside, like walk through the building, see if it gets stronger anywhere in the building, and then go outside and see if I can figure out where this fire is coming from. Just wanted to make sure it wasn't coming from somewhere in the building. And at this point, I'm hearing a lot of sirens pretty close. So I'm like, okay, I think it's somewhere else, and someone else already called the fire department. And sure enough, about a block away from where we live, there was what must have been a pretty big fire, because actually, once I got outside, I could see there was a lot of smoke that wasn't visible from inside. And so there was a fire. I don't actually know what happened. I didn't go close to it to see what was going on. I don't know if anyone was hurt or not, but there was a lot of smoke, and like a ton of people came outside to like try to figure out what was going on. So other people could smell it in their buildings on my block too. So that's 3 fire incidents in the last week. In this week that I've been talking about Randonautica and fires and all sorts of things. So, maybe it's nothing, but it is kind of weird. Like I said, this sort of thing is not super normal. Like, how many times have you been at a restaurant and a battery exploded in the kitchen? Like, my answer to that is 1. I've been in a restaurant 1 time when that happened, and it was last week, the night before I released an episode talking about a explosion that happened not so far from here. So, it's just another example of the sort of weird, random synchronicities that seem to happen, even when just talking about Randonautica. All right, so with that out of the way, let's look at some of the patterns that I have found recurring as I've been randonauting, and just some of the things I've experienced while randonauting. Also, disclaimer, I've said again and again in this series how important it is to write down your randonauting experiences immediately after having them. And I apparently, in typical form, did not follow my own advice, which I discovered when I started going through my notebooks, and I was like, wait, I know I've done more Randonautica trips than this, but I guess I didn't write a lot of them down. And in retrospect, I know why this happened. A lot of the times I've gone randonauting, it's been nighttime, and it was while I was going for a run, and then I would get home and need to, hurry up, take a shower, go to bed, and then I would forget to write it down. So I'm annoyed at my past self, though I understand why it happened. So again, write down your trips if you're able to, because that's what's going to allow you to see patterns in them. So for this, I'm going to draw from the 16 trips that I did take detailed notes for, which even with just 16 trips, there's very clear recurring patterns. So here's the patterns that have come up most often for me. Randonautica takes me to an extremely literal interpretation of my intention. It brings me to an alternative version of what I asked for, maybe because it couldn't bring me to exactly what I asked for some reason. It takes me to somewhere I've been thinking about, whether or not that place relates to the intention that I set, and it seems to have a sense of humor. So let's go through these one by one. So looking at extremely literal interpretations of my intention, here are some examples. So once I set the intention that I wanted to find something to make me feel at peace. I was feeling very agitated. It was early on in the pandemic, and I just needed to chill out, So Randonautica brought me to a yoga studio, which I just couldn't think of a more literal thing that it could bring me to. Like, it could have brought me to a park or something, but there's so many ways to interpret that. A yoga studio is, to me, very clearly tied in with the idea of being at peace. So that really struck me. Once I set the intention to reconnect with nature. So it brought me to a tree-lined street in Sunnyside, which is a neighborhood in Western Queens. So at the point, there was a big line of people on a tree-lined street waiting at a church or a community center. It was weird to see that many people in one place at that point during the pandemic. Not sure what it was for, but I assume it was some sort of aid. So I went around the block to avoid the crowd. And I ended up at Sunnyside Gardens, which is this, I guess, housing development, you would call it. And it has these beautiful, lovely gardens. And as a side note, I also saw a blue Mylar balloon at Sunnyside Gardens, which felt like a sort of wink because, if you're into Hellier at all, you know that blue mylar balloons have seemingly some sort of link to like synchronicities and the paranormal. Other people have reported encountering blue mylar balloons in different kind of paranormal type situations. So it was kind of a significant thing. And I feel like a lot of the time I hear about people encountering them in the woods. So there was something kind of funny about saying, okay, I want to reconnect with nature. And it brought me to Sunnyside Gardens where there was a blue mylar balloon, as if, saying, I know you can't go on a hike in nature right now, but here are some gardens and here's a balloon. This will have to do for now. So once I set an intention that was just star. So it sent me to Crescent Street, which is a street in Astoria. And immediately I thought, oh, well, that's kind of like a crescent moon, which is in the sky next to the stars. And many businesses on that street are adorned with moons because it's Crescent Street. So then I passed a temple with a Star of David on it. Really, it had one carved over the doorway and then two stained glass windows. That was notable since there aren't that many temples in Astoria. I know of two of them, and Yelp agrees, though I could be wrong. But at any rate, there are a bunch of churches here and very few temples, so it stood out to me that it brought me to a temple with the star intention. And then on my run back, I noticed an arched window on a door with a star on it, or like half a star inlaid on the flat bottom of the arch. And also during the run, I swung by Astoria Park, which is where you would go if you wanted to stargaze. I only noticed a few stars in the sky, plus something that seemed like a satellite. But unrelated to stars, another kind of unusual thing that I happened to notice while I was on that trip was there were the remains of like a ritual or a shrine in the middle of the sidewalk by the water at Astoria Park. It had a lot of white candles. It was a slightly broken circle of 7-day candles, and then there were smaller white candles melted into sand and pebbles that had been put in the middle. The candles weren't lit. It's not very unusual to see 7-day candles burning along the Astoria waterfront, but they aren't an everyday occurrence, so they did stand out to me. And I noted it since, it felt relevant to the trip. So then another literal thing that happened was I set the intention of ghost, and the exact point was at the hidden cemetery behind St. George's Church, which I've talked about in my series about the hidden cemeteries of Astoria. I also ran by a bunch of the old Astoria mansions, which have a very haunted vibe, a lot of old Victorians, and a ton of Halloween decorations because it was September. In one instance, I set the intention of diamond, and on my way to the point, I took a wrong turn, which made me pass a fenced-in large driveway or small parking lot with a fence made of vertical iron bars with diamond-shaped adornments that were painted a metallic gold. They looked recently painted, the paint wasn't chipped or anything, and that to me felt like a very clear response to the intention. Unrelated, but it also brought me to a part of the neighborhood that I don't go to very often, which resulted in me seeing a bunch of really unique Halloween decorations that I never would have seen otherwise. Those included a house with inflatable dragons, a headless horseman, a looming pumpkin-headed man underneath a vine-covered part of the Hellgate Bridge viaduct, and a bunch of other stuff. So that's just an example of Randonautica bringing you to, stuff you wouldn't have seen otherwise. So then, probably the most notable trip, at least recently, was when I set the intention of owl. So I did 2 trips, both with the intention of owl, back to back. So the first one, I got to the point, and at the exact point, there was just a long, dark side yard passageway. I was disappointed to not find anything, so I crossed to the other side of the street and started walking north from there, and then I saw a tiny metal owl on a stick in a garden. Behind it was the word autumn. I took a picture, and then I noticed a plastic owl, which looked sort of like a scarecrow-style owl. You know how there's like those plastic sort of realistic ones that you put in your yard to keep birds away? So at that point, I was really excited to have seen 2 whole owls. Like, it was very literal. There were other figurines and statues in the yard, so I was just photographing all the different little non-owl figurines as well. And just as I was turning to leave, I saw another owl, another plastic sort of realistic scarecrow type. I took a picture of it, and then as I was taking a picture of that, I saw in the background another owl, which was like a weird one made of cloth. It was hanging from the brick wall of the house, and it was anthropomorphic, wearing an apron and a bow at her neck, but it had a face that was distinctly an owl with a beak, wide eyes, and that sort of, chevron-shaped crest of feather on the top of her head that was sewn from a contrasting fabric. It looked almost homemade. So that was 4 owls in a single yard near the point. So then, starting from that point, I set the intention of owl again, and I was like, well, I'm not gonna luck out and find another yard full of owls. That would be silly. What would the odds be of having that happen twice in a row? So from there, I set off to another point, and on the way there, I passed a ton of other lawn figurines, not owls, but I passed pink flamingos, eagles, gnomes, fairies, frogs, and turtles. And I get to the point, and the building was just a large tenement-style place with an alleyway behind it, nothing even remotely owl-like there. So I was disappointed, so I went for a walk at Astoria Park. Like I mentioned, a lot of the time it was bringing me by Astoria Park, and I'd be like, I'm so close, I might as well walk around. So on my way home from the park, instead of going my usual route, I walked back the way I came, but I crossed the street from where the point was again. And a couple blocks away from the point, I spotted a cute ornamental owl hanging from a tree, which I hadn't noticed before. It looked hand-painted. Then, as I took pictures of that and the other garden statues, because people in Astoria love garden statues, I spotted 2 more owls towards the fence by the backyard. They were both of the scarecrow variety, plastic and realistic looking. One sat at about ground level, and its head was moved to stare just straight at the fence, which was kind of weird. And then the other was on top of a flagpole in the backyard, facing away from the sidewalk. Which, I feel like if you were to be like, hey, pay attention to this thing, you would put up a flagpole and put the thing on top, right? Like there was no flag flying from it. It was just a flagpole that had an owl on top, which is very strange. So that point, or, very close to the point, had 3 owls. And I think it's worth noting that I didn't see any other owl figurines anywhere else during this 5-mile walk, aside from those 2 yards near the 2 points that Randonautica sent me to. So it's not like, oh, it's just chance. I mean, of course, anything can be just chance, but, it's not like every yard has an owl in it in Astoria, or, every yard with lawn ornaments does. It's like, no, most of them do not. And then I hit 2 that had not one, but multiple. So I mentioned that Randonautica also often sends me to an alternative version of what I asked for in my intention. And these are usually things that I kind of consider a surrogate for my intention. It's not the exact thing, but it's something close. Sometimes I wonder if maybe it just, couldn't bring me to what I asked for some reason, but who knows why this happens. And, one weird thing is that this has happened when I've set intentions that I know have corresponding objects within the radius that I set, but it doesn't bring me to the things I know about, and instead brings me to something similar but not the same. I like to do this sometimes just to test it out and see if it'll bring me to the thing that I know exists and more literally represents the intention. And I'm not sure if maybe it doesn't like the idea of me testing it by being like, oh, I know there's, something relating to my intention. Let's see if it sends me there. It'll just be like, no, I'll send you to something else. It's similar, but not the same. But yeah, sometimes it just feels like it's doing it to spite me or tease me or whatever. But then again, maybe I'm attributing more agency to it than it deserves. But I just can't help feeling that whatever force animates Randonautica is a little mischievous and snarky. So once I set the intention of owl, and this time it did not send me to an owl. I was really disappointed not to see an owl near the point, but I was on a run. I kept running, and then, just as I had gotten to the Astoria waterfront, also by the Hell Gate, but by a different part of it, not the part by Astoria Park, a bird swooped low over me, and it glided almost like how an owl would, really quietly and without really flapping much at all, just, kind of just gliding down. It turned pretty quickly. It was silhouetted. It turned quickly, so it was out of sight, and then it came back toward me. And I knew that it wasn't an owl, right? Like, those are incredibly rare. You're not just going to find them on random parts of Astoria. But the bird came back toward me, and I saw that it was just a juvenile seagull that was just behaving in a very non-seagull-like way. Like, I'm used to hanging out with the seagulls on the waterfront, right? And it just, something about it, it was just gliding much more than a seagull usually does, at least in my experience around there. So in another case, I set the intention of ghost. And this was a trip that I did in September, so there were tons of ghost Halloween decorations that I knew were near where I was starting out from. So I was curious whether Randonautica would send me to one of those ghost decorations. However, instead of bringing me to any of the ghost decorations that I knew were around and within the radius, it brought me by some other stuff that really felt like if someone was like, here, this is similar but not the same, it's what they would give me. So I passed by a plush snowman in a tree. I don't know why someone in September put a snowman in a tree. You know, it just looked like a little kid's stuffed animal. But it was hovering just in this tree on a busy street, just above eye level as I ran by, you know, just on a branch. Then I passed by a funeral home. And then just past the point, I saw a window of just, you know, someone's house that had some religious images in that window. So there was a very ghostly, pale, ethereal Jesus. There was what looked like a saint card for a female saint who I didn't really recognize, who was dressed like a nun. And to me, all those things represented a ghost in different ways. The snowman plush was a white object vaguely resembling a ghost, kind of hovering above me in the tree. The funeral home, that's an obvious one. And the religious images looked ghostly. But also, you could maybe think about the Holy Ghost in that context, etc. So those are some kind of like surrogate things Randonautica sent me to. Now, I think I mentioned this in a prior episode, but multiple times I've considered going somewhere, decided against it, and then Randonautica brought me there anyway, sometimes even ignoring my original intention. My theory for why this happens is that while I set an intention, some part of my mind is still thinking about the original place that I had considered going to. So then instead of following my intention, it sends me to that other place. So let's see some examples. So once I set the intention that it would send me to something that would make me feel at peace. This was the same day that I mentioned earlier where it sent me to the yoga studio. But from the yoga studio, I set that same intention again to see where it would send me. That day, I had thought about going to Roosevelt Island, but then decided against it. You know, Roosevelt Island is just a little further, and it was way outside of the original radius that I had set. However, the first point brought me pretty much to the edge of the radius that I had, a lot closer to Roosevelt Island. So for the second point, it just brought me to a random warehouse. And I was disappointed because clearly that had nothing to do with my intention. But then I realized that the warehouse it had brought me to was only a few blocks away from the bridge to Roosevelt Island. So I decided to go to the island because I was already so close. This was a clever one, I think, because Randonautica found a way to bring me to the place I'd been thinking about, even though it was too far away from my starting point, right? Like it brought me halfway there and then almost the rest of the way there. So once I set the intention to go on an adventure, and that day I'd considered going to the Lint-Riker Smith homestead, which I've talked about in a prior episode, but I decided not to because it was further than I felt like running that evening. This was early on in my randonauting, before I realized you could change the radius. So when I requested a point, Randonautica directed me to the car rental place at LaGuardia Airport, which was about 4 blocks away from the homestead. I didn't go on this trip because it was too far. I really didn't feel like going all the way there, but this struck me as really funny, almost as if the animating force behind Randonautica had a sense of humor, because not only did it want me to go to the place I'd been thinking about going, but I said I wanted to go on an adventure, and it was like, okay, I'll send you on an adventure, go to the airport, and get on a plane, or at least in a car, which felt especially outlandish to me because this was really early on in the pandemic. So another example of this phenomenon is I chose an intention based on a tarot card. I got the 9 of Wands reversed, which I read as burnout, doubt, pointless struggle, and needing to set boundaries. So I decided to ask it to show me something that evokes a sense of wonder and encourages me to focus on stuff that I'm excited about, like the paranormal, the occult, and history. Yes, it was a very complicated intention. So I did that. And of course, earlier in the day, I had considered going to St. Michael's Cemetery, but decided against it. Randonautica sent me to a car repair shop that was right next to the cemetery. So, and maybe you're seeing a pattern here, since I was already so close to the cemetery, I was as close as Randonautica could have sent me based on the radius I gave it, which did not include the cemetery, I decided I might as well drop by. And interestingly, I thought the cemetery would be closed because I think it was like 4:30 or 4, but it turns out the cemetery was open till 5 p.m., so I was able to go in for a half hour or so, walk around a little bit, and then leave. Also, on the way there, I saw some really interesting stuff. So first I saw a house with windows covered with astrological symbols and moons, which I had never noticed before. I saw a building with classical women's heads, except one was worn down and looked kind of like Cernunnos. And I had just watched Hellier the day before, and they talk about Pan and Cernunnos, who I'm probably saying his name wrong, but like he's this Pan type figure. So that was kind of weird. I passed by a mural of the Hellgate Bridge. I passed by some street art that was actively being painted, and a gate made of arrows, which felt like very symbolic to me, and a bunch of other stuff. All of that was very on the nose for my intention of showing me paranormal, occult, and historical stuff that I was excited about, but also, of course, it sent me to the place that I had been thinking about. And then, I mentioned I think that Randonautica has a sense of humor, and you can kind of hear that from the stories I've been telling. And I don't know, maybe I just interpret it as having a sense of humor, but I don't know. I feel like it kind of has some personality. Okay, so what are some other weird things that Randonautica has tended to do? So one other odd thing that I've noticed is that multiple times Randonautica has brought me to the home of someone I know. Of course, I do know some people who live in my neighborhood, but still, there are almost 100,000 people who live in my neighborhood. It's a pretty large neighborhood, right? So it strikes me as odd when Randonautica chooses to send me to the home of someone who I know. And in my experience, there have always been very real, clear reasons why Randonautica has sent me to these locations. And just because it's personal, I'm not really going to get super deep into that, but I'll just give one example. So I set the intention of dragon. And this trip happened shortly after the events at the Hellgate that I talked about in the last episode, after which things started to go just a little askew in some parts of my life. And as it would happen, Randonautica sent me to the home of my boss at the time. I thought it was kind of funny, and I sort of chastised Randonautica for being kind of rude. I don't know, is it weird for me to personify an app to such an extent that I'm like, that's not very nice, Randonautica. I was kind of like, come on, my boss is a nice person. I would never describe them as a dragon. And, I won't go into more detail than this, but a couple months later, when I was laid off from that job, I suddenly realized that it was a very specific warning that I should have heeded. And instead of asking myself what Randonautica was maybe trying to tell me, I ignored any potential message and was just like, well, that's funny but off topic. I basically treated it as if Randonautica was like, people like to complain about their boss. Here, you said dragon, I'll send you to this person's house. And, it maybe would have benefited me to reflect a little bit more, rather than kind of just papering over what it was, perhaps trying to convey. Now, I'm not saying that there's anything I necessarily could or would have done differently had I heeded this thing that I now know was a warning. But I think that if I had been more willing to engage with what Randonautica was trying to tell me, which my interpretation of that is like, not that there was anything wrong with my boss, but like there was a hidden danger, much like a dragon hiding, laying in wait, like something was off with my work situation. And if I had been willing to engage with that, I would have noticed that some things were going on a little bit more quickly. And I probably could have been more psychologically prepared for what would unfold over the next few months. So, let that be a lesson to you. If Randonautica leads you to something where there's a clear potential message, but it seems outlandish or like something you don't want to believe, just allow yourself to consider the possibility that it might be trying to tell you something. Of course, at the same time, don't let your interpretations of your randonauting trips drive too much of your behavior or decision making. And, like I said, if I had heeded the warning, nothing of my outward behavior at work would have changed. But, I could have started applying for other jobs and just psychologically preparing myself for the possibility that my time at that job was going to end. And I think those two behaviors would have saved me a lot of anxiety, or at least they would have alleviated a little bit of the anxiety I would feel over the next few months. So on that sort of grave note, that's what I've got for Randonautica. If you end up doing some randonauting and find some interesting stuff, please let me know. I've already heard some cool stories from folks trying Randonautica out after listening to these episodes, so please keep them coming. And next time, I will finally begin my promised deep dive into the Old Alton Bridge. Now, of course, I pushed this topic out by like a month or two, saying, yeah, I'll definitely be able to finish all of my notes and scripts for the Old Alton Bridge by the time I start publishing those episodes. And, this is maybe going to be the most ambitious series I've done so far on this podcast. I don't know if it's going to be as long as the Fordham series. It seems very possible. Initially, I thought it was just going to be one episode, then I thought it was going to be 2, then I thought it was going to be 5, now I think it's going to be 10. But that's 10 with a question mark. We'll see. All of this to say, I have a lot to say about the Old Alton Bridge. I have uncovered a lot of wild lore about the bridge, a lot of trickster stuff going on with the bridge. There's a lot of history that has been kind of hidden for a long time and has just been coming out over the last few decades. But, one of the sources I'll be referencing a lot for some of the history was just published a couple of years ago. So there's like this really grim and upsetting local history that has like a huge bearing on some of the legends of the Old Alton Bridge. And then there's just such a wealth of stories about paranormal things happening at the bridge, whether it's paranormal investigators reporting back, whether it's, BuzzFeed Unsolved and Ghost Adventures, or whether it's the hundreds of stories I've found in the comment sections and reviews and stuff about the bridge. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff to say about this. So stay tuned for that. The first episode of that series will drop next week. But until then, you can follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. You can check out the show notes with the sources and scripts for this episode and all the others at buriedsekretspodcast.com. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or Spotify. You can email me at buriedsekretspodcast@gmail.com. And also, I now have a Patreon. It has a interactive Google map of haunted New York City that includes both tons of ghost stories and also a lot of other historical stuff and landmarks, etc. I have the Solo Estes Method kit on there, and I've started doing this thing that I'm calling the Secret Library, which is where I'm curating different public domain, cool, weird books and sharing them on my Patreon. So for this week, by the time this episode comes out, I will have posted this kind of funny thing that I found that's like, I guess you'd call it a pamphlet. It's a short booklet book about all these weird, cool spiritualist stuff. It's from the 1900s. It covers planchette stuff and seances and astrology and palmistry and all kinds of weird stuff. And it has some of the most delightful like drawings and design in it. It has all these weird stories and little mini essays like, can animals see ghosts? And just like other weird things that have happened to folks, encounters with creepy things. So keep an eye out for that. And if I have time in the next week or so, I have some other fun stuff I'm working on for Patreon. So I'll holler once that stuff is posted as well. And that's all I've got for this time. Thanks so much for listening.